Good evening, folks. Glad you all came on around. My name is Cyrus Edwards. I'd love to tell you some stories about the early days of this area and Barren County and the frontier that it was, and maybe some of my life experiences. I was very fortunate. I got to experience a lot of different adventures in my life. I was able to do some surveying out in the Western territories that became Western states. I even served in the Civil War, made it all the way up to the rank of sergeant. But as a child, I heard a lot of stories about the early days told by my grandfather and his brothers. And fortunately, I had a good memory and was able to write a lot of those down over the years. But one of the first settlers here in this area was in 1790, and he was a granduncle of mine named Alexander Edwards, and he came here by way of Woodford County up around the Lexington area. They first came here in the autumn part of the year and had his wife and children, and they built a rude cabin, brought a hunting rifle and a couple of pack horses, and after making it through the winter, their survival depended on that garden that they grew that next spring. A few years before that, in 1783, some of the first land patents were issued in this area. A lot of those were up around the big pond up in Hart County and along the Blue Springs Creek. It's amazing how the area changed quickly as some of those patents were issued. Now through this area, something that you all may have heard of, the Great Warriors Trail went through. Now that Great Warriors Trail, it went all the way down to Chattanooga to the Cherokee country there. And it came through this area. It even crossed the Green River up at the Great Buffalo Crossing, and we know that today as Munfordville. It went all the way up into Indiana and Illinois Indian settlements there, and it crossed over at the Falls of the Ohio, Louisville, that area. Another Indian trail intersected the Great Warriors Trail through here, and there was a highly prized lick by many of the animals in that area. Now, this particular trail that intersected, it went on back up to the Logan Station and back up to the Lexington settlements. Now, a few hundred yards away from this lick is actually where my grandfather first settled, and that was about 4 or 5 miles northeast from the Big Blue Spring. It was a well-known area to a lot of our settlers in this area, and a lot of our hunters and a lot of our trappers that came through this area. And well, speaking of trappers, there's one that you all may have heard of, and his name was Henry Skaggs. Henry Skaggs was a good friend of the Edwards family, and well, that's how a lot of the Edwards family ended up here in this area. But Henry Skaggs was a good friend of my grandfather, Cater Edwards, and he made his home there with him until Mr. Skaggs passed. He's got a lot more stories to tell you, and I'll let him do that. But in those early days as well, some of the relations with the Indians were strained. There was not an attack in this area and murder by Indians on white people since 1788. And people began to become more comfortable, and they were settling in the better areas more freely. I'll tell you one of those early stories happened at Oven Spring. It's a tragic event. There at Oven Spring, you had 2 men and 2 women and a young girl. She was about 16 years old. That they were camping. They thought some horse thieves were coming along, and those thieves could have been white, they could have been red, but in this case they were Indians, and they pretended to be friendly. They camped there with them. Those Indians, they even helped prepare a breakfast for them with some venison. After breakfast, they turned on those campers, killed the 2 men. One of the women actually attacked the Indians and was able to kill one of them. They took the girl and the other woman and took off. Those raiders cut out those settlers' hearts, and they stuck them on thorny bushes nearby the spring there at Oven Spring. They ended up taking the girl back to Elk Spring, which now Elk Spring was between Park and Three Springs in that area. They sold her. There was a gentleman here in this area though. His name was Captain William Edgar, and Captain Edgar, he got a group of men together, and he was a well-known gentleman. He had fought in the Revolution. He'd fought in some of the Indian wars, and they tracked those Indians down, got the girl back and the plunder. That was in October of 1792. A lot of you all may recognize that day. That was the year that Kentucky became a state. And as far as we know, that was probably one of the last Indian killings that happened in this area. A lot of you all may think, what kind of education did Cyrus Edwards get if he ended up being a surveyor, and I was also clerk at Horse Cave for a while? Well, I'll tell you, our education wasn't that primitive. I feel like it would probably rival any education that you could get today. A lot of the classical education as well. We had a master school teacher. It was done usually by a man, and there was a paid subscription for the term. It was kind of like a college tuition today. A lot of the folks that were poor and weren't able to pay for that subscription, the families in the community would pitch in to make sure. Education was a privilege. We took it seriously. We learned grammar and physics and advanced mathematics and botany and all the way up to rhetoric and logic. A lot of those younger students, they learned by reciting and maybe singing their lessons. Now the older students, a lot of those older students in those academies and those seminaries, they would actually help teach the younger students, and a lot of times they may debate against each other. That's how we learned in those days, and it was very important. The lessons were long and hard, and then we did not move on until we mastered that lesson that we were working on. But I have to say, sadly, education really began to decline during the Civil War and thereafter as well. At that time, morality was very low in our nation. A lot of the immoral things such as gambling and fighting out on the frontier were taking place, and it took a man of great physical and moral courage to preach in a community like this at that time. We were very fortunate to have somebody that immigrated to Barron County in 1799 like Jacob Locke. Jacob Locke was a good man. He came here from Virginia by way of Mercer County, and he ended up settling back up on Pruitt's Knob near Cave City. He ended up preaching at Mount Tabor Baptist Church for over 40 years and had over 700 baptisms there. But he preached to a lot of the ears in this area a new doctrine, a doctrine of love, of service to others. He talked about moral and correct living after conversion. But he started out preaching in neighboring cabins and eventually had a hand in establishing most of the Baptist churches in the Green and Barren River country. He even helped with a lot of the other denominations. My grandfather told a story about how he heard a sermon in 1813 when he was preaching up at Woodsonville in Hart County. It was a sermon that helped to really calm a tense community. It was about witchcraft. But I could tell you so much more. I could tell you stories about, as a young man, how I worked down at the Old Brick Tavern at Bearwalla. That was a major stagecoach stop along the Lexington-Nashville Pike. I could tell you stories about Horse Cave and how it became a boom town during the construction of the L&N Railroad. Now, that was the beginning of the stagecoach stops. I can tell you about how I got to see the Indian burial grounds that they discovered when they were doing excavation at the intersection of Main and Hibbick Street in Horse Cave. Now, that was quite a sight to see. But I could go on. I could tell you a lot more stories. I could tell you stories about how we so depended on goods that were being brought down the Ohio River for survival in those early days. I could tell you stories about war. I could tell you stories about the tragedy and the loss that comes with it. But you've got a lot of other good folks to hear stories from today, and I appreciate you all letting me share a few minutes stories about the early days. Thank you.
Welcome to the times of long ago. I'll get back to this little book later. My name is Franklin Gorn, and I am distinguished to be the first white child born in Barron County. Now, when my parents came, I was born to John and Elizabeth Gorn, and Ma and Pa came across from the hills of Virginia with her parents, John and Pamela Franklin, to settle in this place. I was born May 3rd, 1798, the sixth child and the third son of John and Elizabeth. And we loved the wilderness of what would become Barron County. Well, this county was formed from Greene and Warren counties. It was a wilderness when we got here. Cane and pea vines were as high as a man's head on horseback. And it was just a wilderness. You can just imagine none of what you all see now was here then. The soil was rich and loose, so much so that horses had to be careful. They could sink up to their fetlocks. Now, the northern part of Barren County was lightly timbered, poorly watered, and there was a lot of strawberry and heather grass about 5 to 6 feet high. You go to the southern part of the county, you would find a lot of timber, heavily timbered, mostly black walnut. And there were beautiful branches, creeks, and springs. Elk, deer, and buffalo grazed all over this country. And it was just a beautiful place. Let me tell you about my father, John Gorn. He was born in Alexandria, Virginia in 1763. He was my hero. I looked up to him. And at the age of 13, he joined the Continental Army and fought in the War of Independence from Great Britain, and was involved in many campaigns, most notably the final one at Yorktown. When I was born, the year I was born, he killed 3 bears in one day. And later, he was captain of a militia during the War of 1812. I looked up to my father, and let me tell you about one of his contributions to this place. When I was 1 year old, he donated 50 acres for this settlement to begin. And on that 50 acres, the first courthouse would be built near where our cabin was, where I was born. And that was an accomplishment for him that he was quite proud of. Glasgow was chosen mainly for its central location in the county, but most of all for the big spring downtown. You would say downtown. Now, my journey through time has shown me that it's hard to find this big spring anymore. It was like being on a scavenger hunt just to try to find a plaque that said anything about it. Seems like they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Glasgow was named after a spot in the road in Virginia where the Glasgow brothers founded the spot in the road back in 1768, and a lot of the early settlers came from there. Now, I know a lot of Scots-Irish would claim a city in Scotland influenced the name, but there was a Glasgow, Virginia, so you can believe what you will. There were a lot of other little establishments founded in this area, spots in the road. I'll just tell you about one of them, Nobob. Now that has an interesting name because there was a group of hunters, and Robert was one of them that went out and never came back. They sent out search party after search party to find him. Every time they came back to the base, well, Nobob just seemed to fit in place to call it, you know? So that's what it was. Indians were numerous in this area, and of course Native Americans were known for their treachery and cruelty, causing a lot of great fear and anxiety among the pioneers here. Perhaps our fear would not have been as great had we been like an early settler named James Forbes. One morning, he went out to find his horses, and he noticed some smoke curling up above the tree line. He went to investigate, and he found 2 stout Indians sitting on a rock, cooking their breakfast. Each had a knife in their hand. He was very wise. He called out, "Babashila," which is a Choctaw word meaning good friend. And immediately they jumped up, dropped their knives, ran to him with outstretched hands, welcomed him to eat with them, and then they helped him find his horses. Well, that was pretty nice of them. Faith was important to the early pioneers. In this direction, you would find a place where the very first church of Barren County would be organized. Same year I was born, Mount Tabor Baptist Church. One of their early pastors, Jacob Locke, had a 40-year tenure there. He baptized 700 people in that creek. And 4 years later, the first church in the town was established. That was First Presbyterian Church, and the first cemetery for the town was located behind that church. I married Louisa Frances Underwood back in October of 1818. We had 6 children. And she was from Virginia as well. Her ma was a cousin of General George Rogers Clark. You might have heard of him. Now, by the time she and her brother came to Kentucky, they were under the care of an uncle, Edmund Rogers. I think you're going to see him tonight. You all just look out for that. But my wife, Louisa, her brother, was someone who had a big influence on my life. Joseph Rogers Underwood was an attorney, and he tutored me on the rudiments of law. I passed the bar in 1820 and then followed him into the position of Barron County Attorney, where I served for about 15 years after he moved to Bowling Green. I enjoyed the practice of law greatly. And I followed him in other areas. We were both members of the Kentucky State Legislature, and we were both part of the Whig Party, which was very popular in Kentucky and Tennessee for about 25 plus years. Sadly, we had some other occurrences, but before I get to the sad note, let me tell you about the fact that I was a buyer and seller of property in this area. Not just land, but caves that were found to be in this land. And they were numerous, and you probably know that. Saltpeter was found in many of these caves. That was useful for making ammunition back in the War of 1812. Well, I purchased this mammoth cave northwest of this place. It was big. It was in a dilapidated state, and I pushed for exploration, trying to discover new passages, and even had the first tour guides. One of the most celebrated guides was the slave Stephen Bishop, and he named a lot of the passages there. One of them is named Gorin's Dome. I did pretty well with the place. When I sold it for $10,000, I doubled my money. Now, I am told this mammoth cave is quite a tourist attraction today. Perhaps you have visited there. Now, I'll return to the sad note. It's not the most happy moment in my life. 1841, my wife, Louisa, died. But happily, I remarried that year. Mrs. Frances Boardman was a 31-year-old widow living in Nashville, Tennessee. She was originally from London, England, and we had 3 children. And I moved to Nashville to be with her. I rubbed shoulders with a lot of distinguished men that you may have heard of: Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, and John Bell, who I entered into law practice with until 1848 or so, when he became a U.S. Senator from the state of Tennessee, and then I moved back to Glasgow and practiced law with my nephew, John Rogers. And yet again, there was a sad moment when my second wife died in 1851. But I remarried for a third time, Deborah Putnam Campbell. And she was very historically inclined, an active genealogist. We had 3 children together, and her research preserved a lot of the Gorin family history, for which I am proud. In 1855, we moved to Louisville, and I had a law practice there until it dissolved during the war between the states. For a time, we moved to New York, and in the early 1870s, moved back to Glasgow, where I would live out the remainder of nearly 80 years. And it was one other notable thing during that period of time, 1874, just after we moved back, I was elected as a congressman to represent this district in the U.S. House of Representatives. So I was honored to do that for a short time. By the end of my life, Barron County was not as large physically. We had had other counties carved from it. Hart, Metcalfe, Monroe counties had come to be. Yet the population of the place had grown. I'll give you an example. When I was 12 years old, there were about 240 people in Glasgow and about 5,000 in the county. By the end of my life, in the 1870 census, the town's population had grown to about 2,000, and the county about 18,000. And I am honored by a plaque on the north side of your present courthouse. More than my single life, though, I hope you cherish all the noble pioneers that settled in this area. May I say to you, descendants, imitate their virtues, their indomitable courage, their honesty, and their simplicity. Now, let me get back to this little book. I wrote it, but I don't remember it. Truth be told, I wrote a series of 30-plus articles that about 50 years after the fact, a descendant put into book form. I'm glad he did. I consider it one of my treasured moments. I put these articles together a year before I died on December 8, 1877. And in those articles, not only did I write about the early pioneers, I wrote about a comet, a great earthquake, wars, elections, and entertainment, how people amuse themselves with such things as foot races and corn shuckings. It has been a notable life, and I tried to capture it all in this little book that I am told you might be able to find at a place called the South Central Kentucky Cultural Center and get a copy for your own. I hear that it is quite a museum of the Barrens. I want to thank you all for stopping by, helping me remember my reminiscences and observations about this wonderful place we call Glasgow.
Thank you.
All right, welcome, fellow travelers. My name's Henry Skeggs. That's S-K-E-G-G-S. A lot of people insist on spelling it with an A. Now, I'm a pretty private guy. You know, don't know, a lot of people know a lot about me. You know more about Daniel Boone and those guys than you probably do me. I was born in 1724, Maryland. Grew up, trader, fur trader, long hunter. Started exploring and joined an expedition into present-day Tennessee, then North Carolina, and another one into the Cumberland Territory. By 1764, I led my first expedition through the Cumberland Gap. Later the next year, I explored the Cumberland River as an agent of Richard Henderson, established a station there, which is present-day Goodlettsville, Tennessee. That fall, while traveling through the New River settlements, I stopped at a cabin to request lodging. You know, in those days, on the frontier, it was customary for travelers to lodge at sparingly located homes. Just like I invited you into my camp. I was welcomed in the home of an old Welsh sailor. He had just retired from his life at sea and settled with his family on the frontier. I was impressed with his fine education and knowledge of the world as he was mine. I had never seen a remote cabin filled with such a collection of books. I told him I'd been to Canada during the French wars, and I was headed to Louisiana. We became great friends, and I remained there through the winter, insisting to pay for my lodging. Through the years, I continued to visit my old friend. In the spring of 1769, I went with a large party of explorers, hunters, and trappers through the Cumberland Gap and down to the Cumberland and Green Rivers to the border of the Barrens, which is now Greene, Hart, Metcalfe, Barren, and Warren counties. They called us the Long Hunters because a lot of us didn't have homes, or we were absent from our homes. Some of the party went home the next year. A few of us stayed a few years. Went down to the French settlements on the Mississippi. I stayed with a couple of guys from the party, and we spent most of the winter of 1770 and 1771 trapping beaver at Beaver Dam at Beaver Creek in Barren County, where the Glasgow and Munfordville Road cross the creek. Now, today there's a street in Glasgow called Long Hunters Trail, and you'll see the historic marker there at the corner of Lexington Avenue and 31E. After the war, my old friend died from his injuries fighting at Kings Mountain. But before he died, I promised him that I would take his family from North Carolina through the Cumberland Gap to Bryan Station because he wanted his children to have a good education. Now, at that time, the Transylvania Seminary was the only and first college west of the Allegheny Mountains. We had talked about the Barrens, and many of his sons relocated from Lexington to Barren County. I kept close ties with the family until I died in 1820. Lived with one of his sons, Cater Edwards, at Blue Springs Grove. I'm buried at that place, at the park. just over the line in Metcalfe County where Eric and Debbie Walton now live. Now, I told you I'm a private guy, but Cater's grandson, Cyrus, you may have met him earlier, wrote a good number of stories, and some of them involve me. One story is about the murders of Frenchman's Knob. So long story short, years later, with my various relationships and adventures, I was able to help a widow retrieve some garments from her wedding that had been taken from her when they murdered her new husband. All that resulted in a developer receiving legal title to the land that we now know as Mumfordville. You should read it. It's a good story. Well, not gonna spend the night. You may be on your way. It's good knowing you.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is so good to see you. My goodness, I see that I don't have enough seats for you, though. Times sure have changed since I entertained guests. But I assure you, I grew up knowing the proper way to entertain. I am Esther Alexander Garrison. I was born September 28, 1762, more than 260 years ago in Delaware. My parents were Hezekiah Alexander and Mary Sample Alexander. When the French and Indian War began, Indian attacks on the settlers became frequent. So when I was about 5 years old, my father purchased 300 acres of land in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and moved the family, including 6 children, to North Carolina. I was so fortunate to be born into an affluent family. My father, Hezekiah, founded Queens College, the first college south of the Virginia colony. But the king disapproved of it and taxed it to support the Church of England. Well, that settled my Presbyterian father's desire for independence from England. In North Carolina, we lived in a beautiful stone house, like the ones that the Germans built in Pennsylvania. It was made of random native stone pattern with an oyster shell mortar. It was a 2-story house plus an attic and a basement, and it had a shake roof. It still stands today and is the oldest house in Charlotte, North Carolina. Today it's used as a museum for anyone to visit. Our family was so proud of our home, and we entertained many people, some very, very important for our independence from England. I remember as a teenager hearing the discussions in our home from my father and others as they met to fashion a course of action that would lead to our freedom. My father was one of the 26 signees of the Mecklenburg Resolves on May 31st, 1775. It declared that all British laws were null and void. The Declaration of Independence was signed more than a year later in 1776. My father also served on the committee that fashioned the first North Carolina Constitution. Well, a few years after the war was over, a handsome young soldier wooed me with a long romantic poem. He was Samuel W. Garrison, and he was born in Maryland in 1762 and had moved with his parents, John and Hannah Garrison, to Mecklenburg County. He had joined the Revolutionary Army when he was just 17. He fought in battles in South Carolina and Georgia. Then he came home and re-enlisted. We were married March 14, 1786 in Mecklenburg County, and we settled there to raise our family. My parents provided all of their children by giving away most of their possessions before they died. My father's will stated that his granddaughter Caroline Garrison was to receive a chest of drawers, and I received 2/3 of my mother's clothing, very, very valuable. 11 years after that, the call of land in the frontier appealed to Samuel and I. We sold our land in North Carolina and moved with 5 of our children into the wilderness. We settled on a 200-acre plot of land in Base Fork Creek which is now Allen County. It was mostly unsettled and very few people lived nearby. The log cabin that we built, it wasn't much, especially compared to my father's house. I can tell you, I adjusted to frontier life, but I sure missed entertaining and the social graces. But times changed and I moved forward. My brother, Dr. James Alexander, was a surgeon in the Revolutionary War and became the first surgeon in Allen County. He and his family moved to Rough Creek. He served as magistrate and sheriff of Allen County. It was wonderful to have family close by. As Samuel and I settled into our community, 3 more children were born. My husband was a blacksmith at the time, and he even built the first grist mill in Allen County. He was always interested in civil and political affairs. He was one of the early settlers to petition for a road from Barron County to go in the direction of Logan County. He had a classical education, and he wrote poems about his ideals and his goals. Once he even sent a letter to President Madison with the idea that every citizen should send $1 to the president to pay for a big battleship for defense whenever against England during the War of 1812. My husband, Samuel, was elected as the first state representative to the Kentucky General Assembly from Allen County. What an honor that was for the two of us. He served a 2-year term and was active in writing some of our laws. When the town of Scottsville was laid out, lots were sold to pay for a courthouse and other public buildings. Samuel and I bought 14 of the lots on the southwest side. We wanted our little town to grow and be successful and make a good place for our children to live and grow. Samuel has a tombstone in the old Scottsville Cemetery that honors his military service. At the age of 71, he received a pension for his service, $30 annually. I remember him as that young soldier that stole my heart and the patriot who loved his country. My stone is next to his, and I am the oldest woman with a tombstone in the Allen County Cemetery. I hope that you've enjoyed hearing about our frontier days in Allen County and how my family played an important role in that endeavor. Thank you all for visiting tonight. Enjoy.
Hello, I'm Edmund Rogers. Welcome here tonight. I hope you don't mind if an old surveyor has a seat and goes through a few of the notes in his field book tonight. I made a lot of notes over the years. I'd like to share a few of them with you. I was born May 5th, 1762 in Caroline County, Virginia, near the end of the French and Indian War. My grandfather was a brother to Anne Rogers Clark, the mother of General George Rogers Clark, and his brother William, of William and Clark fame. That turned out to be what you'd call a helpful networking for the survey business, but more on that later. In 1781, at the age of 19, I answered the call for volunteers in Virginia. My brother John was a captain in the Virginia line fighting for independence already. I was assigned courier duty. Going from one army to the other and back, I saw the great Washington, Knox, Lincoln, Lafayette, and many others. I was present at the surrender of Cornwallis. At the age of 23, I came into the wilderness of Kentucky carrying land grants. After the war, we soldiers flooded into Kentucky, if not by the hundreds, by the thousands. Most of us had military land grants but didn't know where the land was. After the Revolution, I spent the rest of my life as a surveyor locating military lands. I began business as a surveyor in the fall of 1783 in Clark's Grant, as it was called, on the north side of the Ohio River, opposite to Louisville. That's where those family connections sure came in handy. In the spring of 1784, my operations were changed to the military district in Kentucky, on the south side of the Green River. I soon settled upon a tract of land upon which I afterwards laid out the town of Edmonton. Proud to say they named it after me. Surveying the wilderness was dangerous. Many creeks and branches were named by my survey crews. One of them was a tributary of the Little Barren River, now known as Nobob Creek. My survey crew named it for the missing hunter Bob, who failed to return home one evening and was never seen again. We never knew for sure exactly what happened to him, but I've got a pretty good idea. On one occasion, my survey crew was attacked and the Indians killed one of our company. I sure was glad to have my firearm, but you see back here with me, I barely escaped. I met my wife, Mary Shirley, when I was 46 years old. I was in a tree looking for boundary markers in the distance, and I fell out of the tree. And Mary saw me and took me to her father's house. I had 3 loves in my life: Mary Shirley, who I affectionately called Polly, the town of Edmonton, and my country. Mary and I had 7 children, 7 daughters and 1 son. I hope that my descendants remember our country and devote themselves to the maintenance of her rights like we who established its independence. I'm very grateful that the community that I loved has honored many friends from the pages of history here tonight. It's been a privilege to share my story with you. I was 81 years old at the time of my death, in August 28, 1843. I was in a perfect state of mind to my last breath. About an hour before I died, I was seen to smile, and when being asked why I was smiling, I said I was thinking of the vain efforts of 3 of the best doctors in the country to save an old man whose time had come. I'm buried in Edmonton. My stone is engraved with these words: pioneer and surveyor of southern Kentucky, soldier of the Revolution, and founder of the town of Edmonton, after whom the town was named. Married Mary Shirley in 1809. And with that, folks, I bid you a good night. Thank you.
Okay, well, hello everybody. Good evening. Let me introduce myself. My name is Hannah Pennington. I was the wife of Richard Pennington, who was a soldier in the American Revolution under Captain Enoch at Fort Virginia. But you might know my brother, Daniel Boone, just a little bit better. You could say I'm from a little bit of everywhere. My father, Squire Boone Sr., was born an Englishman and a Quaker. His family moved to Pennsylvania in the 1700s in pursuit of religious freedom. That's where he met my mother. They were married at the Gwinnett Convention at 1720, and then soon had all 12 of us kids. My father ended up being expelled as a Quaker after my oldest brother Israel married a worldling. He was censured after my oldest sister Sarah had married one too, but I guess Israel getting married was the last straw. So father, despite having a very lucrative business in weaving, decided to move us all down to North Carolina. I guess things got a little awkward in Pennsylvania. So down to North Carolina we went, but that move only lasted about a decade. When I was a young teenager, I was caught by Indians and scalped. I survived through it, but it left me with a nasty scar on the back of my head. Father had had enough and told Mother we were moving back up to Pennsylvania, but that didn't last long either. So we moved back down to North Carolina when I was in my older teens. When I was about 17, I met John Stewart and I fell in love instantly. He was best friends with my brother Daniel, and they went on hunting trips all the time, which I found quite convenient because it meant I could see John whenever I really wanted, because he was always with my brother. Well, when I was about 18, John told me that he'd asked my father about calling on me. I was delighted. We courted for a year, and after that were married. We had 3 little ones, and John went out on hunts to earn a living selling pelts. So while my husband John went out on journeys with my brother Daniel, it was a little lonely, but I got through with chores and dealing with the little ones. But John went out on one particularly long hunt with my brother Daniel, and then I realized I was pregnant with our 4th child. I was so excited to tell John when he got back, and I waited, and then Daniel came down my road. My girls went and ran to Daniel and were asking all sorts of questions about the hunt and where their father was, but when Daniel looked at me, I knew. I had been so excited to tell John everything that he had missed while he was gone, but when I looked at Daniel, I knew that my husband was never coming home again. I screamed and cried so violently I scared the kids. Daniel had to take me by the shoulders and sit me down in a chair, get me to keep myself together. I was about to have 4 little ones. I didn't have much time to lose to hysteria. I had to keep it together. When I finally calmed my nerves down, I asked Daniel what happened, and that's when he told me he didn't know. John had gone missing after he went looking at his traps one morning. He just never came back. Daniel and his men looked far and wide for my John to no avail. He figured that John was floating at the bottom of the Kentucky River. Well, 5 years passed. I'd been raising my 4 little kids, and Daniel sent one of his men down my road with a message, a shot pouch, and a powder horn. It didn't take me long to notice that that powder horn had my late husband's initials on it, J.S. And then the man told me, when they had been clearing out a path to get down to the Cumberland Gap, they found an old hollow sycamore tree and looked inside. And what they found was a skeleton with a broken thigh bone, that powder horn, and the shot pouch. They put it together that when John had gone out looking for his traps that morning, he'd been caught in some sort of fight, had broken his leg, and had crawled into that tree to try to get some sort of refuge. But he bled out before he could ever get back to camp. So now, finally knowing that we had found my husband's body and we could put that to rest, I had some small sense of relief, and I could finally let go of that hope that John was going to come walking back through my door. A couple years went by, and I realized that raising 4 little kids and doing all the chores in a frontier house was not going to get any easier as I got older. I realized it was time to look for a husband again, but this time I not only had the scar on the back of my head, I had a big scar in my heart and 4 little ones to boot. I was lucky to find a good man, but then I found Richard Pennington. He was a good man, a few years younger than me, but stout and sturdy, and unlike my John, who liked to travel the land in pursuit of a hunt, my Richard liked to plow it instead, which was a nice stable living. So he helped make a living for me and my 4 kids, and we ended up having 4 more of our own kids. After they all grew up and got old and married, Richard turned to me and asked if I wanted to move down to Kentucky. And I was ready to leave life in North Carolina behind. It had had quite a few troubles for me. So we ended up moving down to Monroe County. We ended up moving there near the old Mulkey Meeting House, if any of y'all know what I'm talking about, because Jonathan Mulkey, whose family name that bears, had actually married me and Richard. So we moved down to Monroe County. We lasted there a few years. It was a good time. I got along great with those families. But Richard got a little poorer in health when we were older and wanted to move down to Tennessee to help one of our sons kind of get along. So we ended up going down to Tennessee, living there for a while, and I got to be with Richard when he drew his last breath, which is such a comfort to know I was there. But I realized I was no spring chicken either, and that I needed to go back up to Monroe County, where the rest of my living family was, my 2 daughters with families and my church family too. So I ended up moving back there. About as soon as I got there, I decided to write to Daniel to tell him to have me buried down there. I wish I could have been buried between Jonathan and Richard, but that wasn't feasible. So I decided to be buried nearest to most of my living family and my church family too. And that's where I reside today. Well, I guess I got a little lost in memories there, but I hope you all enjoyed it. Good evening, and thank you.